American foreign policy has drastically changed throughout the presidencies of President Nixon and President Obama, but in some ways, certain worries and problems have certainly remained the same. Let us take a look into how these two presidents dealt with problems in the world stage. President Nixon was most remembered for his withdrawal from the Vietnam War, his signing of the Strategic Arms Limitation talks with the Soviet Union, and his attempts at diplomatic peace with China. When analyzing Nixon's foreign policy, an immediate factor that should be noted was his steadfast approach towards his doctrine of foreign policy, also called the Nixon Doctrine. Nixon was famous in his efforts of détente and improving relations with the world superpowers, notably the Soviet Union. In Vietnam, Nixon also eventually displayed his keen eye for détente after reading the public opinion. Nixon's major goal in Vietnam was known as Vietnamization, in which he would steadily withdraw American troops from the battlegrounds and leave the fighting to the southern Vietnamese. This foreign policy call was very critical to his overall public approval ratings. A poll done after Nixon signed the Paris Peace Accord, which ended the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, showed a 75% approval rating compared to 41% just 1 year earlier. Nixon's hard-headed policy of détente through his foreign policy exploits on a world stage helped him in his efforts to mend relations on a global scale with world powers. Besides the Vietnam War, Nixon also dealt with bringing American peace to the two major communist world superpowers at the time. In the Soviet Union, Nixon sought to approach détente with them. A classic case of Nixon's strong foreign policy came into light when he avoided a potential second Cuban Missile Crisis by forging on in his active diplomatic strategies with the Soviet Union. In the midst of the Cold War, Nixon displayed an authoritative approach to how the U.S. should maintain its composure when dealing with the communist nations, and brought out a new 21st century style of foreign policy. This was shown when dealing with China as well. Nixon attempted to forge new trade relationships and provided a doorstep into the foreign nation. This monumental meeting between Nixon and Mao Zedong sparked a turning of the tides to the Cold War and further showed the need to pull out of Vietnam. This step taken by Nixon was also a critical process in his foreign policy, and his skills of active rather than passive diplomacy proved to pay dividends. The issue of whether sending troops into foreign territory in order to either advance American policy or support other nations was a right or wrong call continued to be a pervasive topic more than 30 years later. President Obama's term showed how foreign policy could drastically change throughout the span of several decades. President Obama's major political foreign presence was focused in the Middle East, specifically Afghanistan and Iraq. The war on radical Islam and terrorism after 9/11 became a very tricky subject to deal with. As Obama's term lengthened, we can look back and analyze how the situation escalated from merely going to war in the Middle East to dealing with the legitimate unsolvable problem of an ideological standpoint. In his 2008 campaign, Obama became known as an anti-war advocate and claimed that he would turn the bad war that George Bush began into a winnable good war. This 2008 Obama, after serving his terms, was forced to come into terms with how unattainable that goal would actually be. The fight in the Middle East, unlike Vietnam, was not as simple as just pulling out of the region. If the United States simply retreated, all of the lives lost and all of the progress made would simply be absolved, and the Middle East would continue churning out terrorists and extremists. The Afghanistan problem is very bleak, and ultimately Obama was unable to come to a long-term solution to the problem. Obama's situation is reminiscent to that of Richard Nixon's in that he inherited a war from Bush, just as Nixon inherited his Vietnam War from Johnson. But unlike Nixon, the problem was not solved and ultimately must be passed on to the next American leader, Donald Trump. Looking forward, the foreign policy that Trump has displayed over his presidential run and first year in the White House has also shifted. While Trump originally acknowledged the need to quickly pull out of Afghanistan, he, during his first term, he saw into the complexity of the issue and remains questionable in his actions. When analyzing the Obama administration's foreign policy tactics towards modern-day Russia and China, it has a notable move towards improving relationships with them. In Russia in particular, in what Obama called the Russian reset, it had a similar manner to Nixon's move in China. Obama attempted to mend relations in Russia. While this appeared to be a good move to advance the two-world relationships, critics of Obama's foreign policy debated on whether this move was too weak and gave Russia too much leeway in terms of international affairs. In China, the Obama administration maintained a similar approach to friendly and peaceful diplomatic relationships. The administration relied on supporting Chinese growth, however wanted to maintain and promote China as a protector of sorts, especially towards a nuclear North Korea. In conclusion, while the history of foreign policy in America is far from stable, there are many trends surrounding how the executive branch and the presidencies deal with conflicts. While Obama's foreign policy may differ from Nixon's, the struggles that both face are inexplicably difficult and complex to deal with.